Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan, and this is my co-host Zongjun, who also goes by Sam.
Hello, hello.
And we're the co-founders of Senko Matcha Products.
Yeah, we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. And this episode, we have Dr. Rebecca Corbett with us today to talk about her journey with tea and Japanese culture. Welcome.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Ryan and Sam.
Awesome. Yeah, so before we start, could you please maybe share a little bit more about your personal and professional background?
Sure. You can probably tell from my accent, I grew up in Australia and I first encountered Chanoyu as a high school student. I went on a 1-year exchange. I was living in Kuroishi City in Aomori Prefecture, which is the northern part of the main island of Japan. And it was just a sort of coincidence in a way, or random connection, that my host family was at a Sokozen temple. So my host father was the head priest of the temple. So yeah, it was very interesting for me as an exchange student. What you want is that, generally speaking, would be, that kind of cultural connection. So I got a lot of that living at the temple. And then his older sister was a tea teacher. Their mother had been as well. And that was in the Urasenke School of Tea. And so very early on in my year there, they asked, would you like to go to a tea ceremony class? And it was with my older host sister. And I think they probably thought I was just going to go to one class, but something just clicked with me. And also, as an exchange student, I was like, I'm here to learn, culture and improve my language skills. I've been studying Japanese at school in Australia for a few years by that point. And so I just went every week for the year. My host sister actually finished her lessons after a few months. And I was told that's because she's getting married. And that was kind of my first window as well into one of the reasons that young Japanese women do this is bridal training. And also the class that I was in, all of the other students were older Japanese women, mostly over 70. And so I didn't realize it at the time, but I was getting this very kind of classic or stereotypical introduction to this world of Chanoyu in Japan in the contemporary period. That's young women doing it for bridal training, older women doing it as a hobby when their children have grown up and husbands have retired. And because it was the Urasenke School of Tea, I didn't realize that during the year that I was there, at the end of the year, my teacher said to me, there are teachers overseas in this school of tea, and we were able to look up and find that there was a branch in Sydney where I was going back to go to university, and so I was able to keep practicing. So that was 1999, so 26 years ago now that I had started. And then professionally as a university student, I was majoring in East Asian or Asian studies and Japanese language and history. And so I was really interested in just kind of combining all those things. And through my practice of Chanoyu, a lot of teachers encourage you to read more about the history, or they're telling you things about Chanoyu history. And I was reading on my own, but I felt there was a disconnect between that and my academic learning within university. I was doing a lot of gender history and women's history, and I kept asking questions and of tea teachers and not getting very elucidating responses. And so I was interested in looking for it just kind of felt like a natural progression for me to go into PhD research, exploring the connections between gender and particularly women's role within Chanoyu historically, because I kept being told, well, women didn't practice prior to the Meiji period, and that was full stop, that's the end of the story. And that's what Chanoyu teachers said, that's what the history said, and that just didn't make sense to me based on what I knew of the Edo period from my other classes, and just a basic cursory glance at some materials I was finding examples where women were studying. So that then became the focus of my PhD research. And so now I'm, a few decades into professionally being a historian of Japan, and specifically my research focus is on Chanoyu, both in the Edo and Meiji periods. And I would say I'm more of a social and cultural historian who's particularly interested in the narratives around things like gender and history from below. So like not looking at the great tea masters like Senno and Rikyu who are credited with shaping the practice, but trying to look at more complicated stories and look at a broader perspective on Chanoyu history.
You gave a really interesting line in a previous podcast interview that you did, and I think you said something along the lines of like, "I'm sick of hearing about Rikyu." It's like pretty interesting because like it's sort of a great man theory of history when you learn
Yeah.
anything about Japanese tea, right? You learn about Eisai, you learn about Rikyu, and that's kind of it. And it's
Yeah.
like a simple history.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm probably being a bit provocative or, deliberately sarcastic when I say something like I'm sick of hearing about Rikyu, but there's a lot of truth to that as well because yeah, I think you just hit the nail on the head. Like the number of publications that we read, either in English or Japanese, that just give us the same version of history. And there were these couple of guys who brought tea seeds over from China, and actually, if you read Wayne Farris's recent book that's A Bowl for a Coin, a commodity history of
Yes.
Japanese green tea, he actually, makes us question this narrative anyway about the exact involvement of Eisai and how much we can credit to these historical figures that start the narrative. And then, we get to, Murata Shuko Takinogoro Senno Rikyu, and then that's kind of it. Or then there's a few important people after them, and that's where we are today. And there's hundreds of years of history in between all of that. And I think in other fields of history, whether we're talking Japanese history or more broadly globally, that great man narrative, like people really interrogate that and say this is, we can't just credit everything to a couple of great men, but we don't do that so much in Chanoyu history. I think more recent scholarship certainly does. And so I prefer to describe Rikyu myself, not so much as the founder of Chanoyu, but as the most articulate and well-known tea master of his day. And I think we have to remember the fact that his ancestors, and particularly the Zen schools of tea, have become so dominant, and so they're really shaping the narrative. And so, and that starts like 100 years after his death with the Nampo Roku and the sources being created that are attributed to Rikyu, and it's Rikyu said this, Rikyu did that, but this is already being written 100 years after his death. So they're seeing this constant process of shaping this narrative that obscures a lot of what else was going on both before, during, and immediately after his lifetime. And if I can just give a little plug to a project I'd recently done with a whole group of colleagues who are also scholars of Chanoyu as well as teachers, we created a resource called Teaching Tea, and it's on a website called Japan Past and Present. And we're trying to make in English the most recent scholarship more accessible and available to people. Our particular aim is for use in undergraduate classrooms at universities because that's our profession. But there's a great essay by Morgan Patelka, who's a wonderful scholar of the 16th century, and it's about tea diaries in the 16th century. And he makes this point of just trying to complicate the picture and people's understanding of like where Rikyu fits into that actual time period and looking at kind of the broader landscape of what was going on in his life.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
I guess with the Zen schools, because they kind of are the winners within modern day in terms of dominating the narrative. I mean, that's how they legitimate their authority, is their link back all the way to Senyo Rikyu. So these are, I don't know, it's easy to follow the path of incentives.
Yes, I think so. And I think we have to remember that a lot of the sources, in terms of primary sources that we use as historians, a lot of those belong to the tea schools, and they are deciding when to release them and who to release them to. So that's another way that they can control the narrative. And, I have to be careful with this. I straddle both sides. I am both an Urasenke tea practitioner and I'm a scholar and a historian of Chanoyu. And so as a student in Urasenke, like within any Japanese cultural practice, you're sort of taught not to question. Your teacher tells you something, the hierarchy tells you something, and that's what you do. And you don't push back and you don't ask why. But as a scholar, it's the complete opposite approach, right? And
Yeah.
we're supposed to question everything. So yeah, it's been tricky for me at times, but I certainly found with my early research on women's participation in the Edo period, there was this clear narrative. And in fact, fortunately, it started to change a bit. Most sources in both Japanese and English, the scholarship was saying women were forbidden from practicing prior to the Meiji period and prior to Gengen-tai opening up the
Mm,
doors of tea to practice to women. So this is
okay.
particularly privileged in the role of an Urasenke Iemoto, so the head of the Urasenke school of tea in the Meiji period. This is giving him that role. He opens the doors of tea to women. So he's like the savior, the hero, right?
Mm.
And
And
that's only
forbidden is
possible.
a very specific word too.
Yeah.
Like that's
And they all of those sources that say forbidden refer to this one particular tea master from the Edo period. And it's like, okay, well, even if he said that women were forbidden from practicing, there's a wealth of other sources and writings by tea masters who were saying the opposite. That was kind of an important point for me to get across. And I guess I had an awakening myself of like, Urasenke is presenting one narrative of history, and my job as a scholar is to question that and look more broadly. And I think that that's my problem with a lot of material available in English is that people aren't clear whether they're presenting an Urasenke official narrative of Chanoyu history or whether they're looking more broadly. I'd say 90% of the cases people are presenting an Urasenke version of Chanoyu history without actually acknowledging that that's what they're doing.
It's almost like the right version of the history that they want everyone to be agree
Mm,
upon.
yeah, it's like a controlled
yeah.
narrative.
A control.
I think it makes sense for the Urasenke to have their own version of history that they're putting out there. I just think there needs to be more clarity around that of like, this is the history of our school versus this is the entire history of Chanoyu as a cultural practice, which because it obfuscates so much. And when you look at the landscape of the Edo period in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, Zen schools were not the dominant schools. There were
Mhm.
many other schools of tea that were more prolific. So it's a very different landscape to what we're in today. And I think that people don't always realize how much it's shifted across the last kind of like 150 years since the Meiji period, where now it's really Urasenke and Omotesenke that dominate almost everything.
I guess from a research kind of perspective, like it's really hard to really reference all of these, officially published history by the schools. And like, how do you find other materials? Like, what are other materials that people can reference or research on that can kind of show a different narrative of the history and the culture?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And actually, Morgan Patel, who I mentioned earlier, was a great mentor for me in this. So his research on raku ceramics was what he found was that similar to how Urasenke Patel's narrative around Chanoyu, the
Mm,
raku household also has that similar kind of system.
mm,
And what he found was that if he went outside of those core institutions of raku, Urasenke, or Omotesenke, then there's sources that they historically, so we're talking 17th, 18th centuries, sources that they didn't create and they therefore don't control. And then when you actually look at those, you find a much more complex, nuanced, interesting picture anyway. So it's actually
mm,
kind of a win-win for us as
Mm,
scholars. So
yeah.
mm.
in the end, I would say that what I found is in terms of my research and that's in the book Cultivating Femininity, I don't think I have any primary sources that are from the Urasenke or Omotesenke schools.
Mm.
Mhm.
Chiefly because I couldn't get access. The number of times I had people tell me in Kyoto, both scholars and professionals within the Chanoyu world, when I say I'm researching women's involvement in Chanoyu Native period, you won't find anything. There's no story there. You can't write about that. This is what I was being told. But I was finding commercial publications from the Edo period. So these were woodblock printed, commercially available books that were being sold on a mass market scale, and I was finding those and modern reprints of those publications by publishers, and they had nothing to do with when they weren't being marketed by the modern publishers as like sources for Chanoyu history. They were being marketed and sold as academic libraries as sources for women's history. And so I was finding materials in there and materials created by other schools of tea. So I focused in like one whole chapter on a manuscript for women's tea practice from the Sekishu school of tea. And then in a later chapter, another version of that same manuscript by Inaosuke, who's a well-known figure in Japanese history. And the Sekishu school of tea, we don't really hear that much about that today, right? It's not significant in the current Chinese landscape, but it was actually very significant in the Edo period. So basically, I just kind of had to look outside of the official SAM sources, if you like. I'd love to see, like, maybe there are more materials that they
That's very
control, but I was able to tell a story without using them. So
almost like investigative journalism. Very,
yeah, I
very,
think that's what being a historian is like a lot of the time, and
yeah.
you have to think very creatively at times about if you want to tell a story, how can you do it? But there's also people who've used the official Urasenke or Omotesenke Sen school related sources and done so in creative ways as well. You know, doing the classic historical techniques of reading between the lines and or reading against the grain and just
Hmm.
focusing on sources actually from the 16th century rather than looking at like just the 100 years later and further down the track versions of those sources. So I think the scholarship on Chinese history has changed a lot in the last 20 years and is becoming more complicated and more nuanced, and we're actually getting a better understanding of the history of the practice in a way that isn't just presenting like a single school authorized narrative. But that's
Hmm.
not so widely available to people, and that's one of the things we're trying to do with the Teaching Tea project is so we have a lot of like short essays that are like 2,000 words and are meant to be written in an easy to read, accessible way versus, you know, a lot of our academic books and articles, they're behind paywalls or they're very expensive and they're not written to be accessible. I've seen a few people on like tea blogs say that they've read my book, but they say like it's interesting, but it's very academic. And I'm like, yeah, it is because it's an academic book, and that's how I had to write it. But I think it's great that like people interested in matcha and people interested in Chanoyu want to know more about the history. So I like to get as much information as I can out there to people so that they understand that there's more to it than just like Senno Rikyu came up with this thing and we've been doing it the same way for 400 years since then.
And actually, it's interesting. It feels like, a lot of the new modern matcha brands, when they try to connect their products, their matcha products, their whisking bowls, their whisks, their implements, the things that they sell, they're like trying to bring legitimacy to their products and their brand in a very similar way, I think, to how everyone is trying to bring legitimacy. Like the people who were historically practicing tea and they wanted to sort of do these practices of these quote unquote great men before them, or even good wives and wise mothers, and accumulating some form of cultural capital to bring like legitimacy to themselves and to elevate themselves. It's interesting how like the history rhymes here, and everyone's
Mm-hmm.
trying control over these narratives. It's interesting
I,
to see.
I think we actually see that with tea history even beyond Chanoyu. And I had to credit some of the students in my history seminar I'm teaching this semester that it's a seminar on tea culture in pre-modern East Asia. And so we've been talking a lot about this in class. And if you
Mm,
go back to early Chinese sources on tea and you look at something like Lu Yu,
mm.
it's like there's the right way to have the water, there's the right way to do this. And one of my students was comparing it to like there's coffee snobs today, right? And she was like, oh wow, there's tea snobs too, and there's always been tea snobs. So I think there's something maybe just inherent in all of these these practices around these beverages of just like I'm defining the right way to do things and I know what's correct and I'm doing it the way that this person did it before me as the way to claim your legitimacy.
Very top down.
That's a good point around Nuyu too, because you hear that all around Chinese tea circles too.
But the only difference is, like at least in modern days, Chinese tea culture community, there isn't a institutionalized entity to define all these rules.
Mhm.
But instead, we have like 200,000 different tea gurus
Yes.
telling other people the right way.
Yeah.
It's the other extreme.
Unclear which one's better, top down or bottom up authority over this narrative. Both create a lot of complexities to navigate as someone who loves tea. If we really zoom out and like, especially for our listeners who might be less familiar with tea ceremony, how can we roughly define what Chanoyu is and how and why people have practiced it in Japan?
Yeah, I should be able to answer
Apologies.
that question, but
It's
it
a
is
difficult question.
difficult. Yeah. So first off, if we start with something really basic, Chanoyu literally means hot water for tea. That's why we don't tend to translate it into English, because that's not a very helpful translation. Tea ceremony has become the accepted translation. I have a lot of problems with that term. I think it's very misleading, and a lot of people who don't understand the practice come in with these preconceptions and keep talking about, well, it's a ceremony and it's this and that. And I really feel that it's a practice and it's not a ceremony and it's not a ritual. That's my personal view. Other people can have their own views, but certainly when I'm engaged in Chanoyu, I don't think that I'm conducting a ceremony, and I don't think that I'm conducting a ritual. I think I'm involved in a practice. I'm practicing something. I would like us to get to the point where we can use Chanoyu in English just like we do ikebana, just like we do karate, karaoke. I know that we don't pronounce those like karaoke, karate. We have the more anglicized pronunciation, but we're just using the Japanese word and we're all okay with that. And Chanoyu is actually now in the Oxford English Dictionary. So that's, I was told by a copy editor that I didn't need to italicize it anymore because it's in the dictionary.
Oh, that's progress.
Right. So that's progress, yeah. And then in terms of what it is, so I would say it's a complex set of practices that all involve the preparation and consumption of matcha. And some people see it as a spiritual or religious practice. I would say that that is part of it. Obviously, there's clear connection with Zen Buddhism, but I don't think it's a spiritual or religious practice in and of itself. By which I mean some people practice it in a religious or spiritual way, but many people do not, and both are possible. So you might compare it to yoga in that sense, that can have like the spiritual religious side but doesn't have to have it. I guess what's important to note, like we've just been talking about, is there's a lot of schools or lineages of practice within Chanoyu that have developed over the last 400 years, and at its core everything is the same. I feel like that's how it is described as one practice, but each of these lineages have their own ways of teaching and their own slight divergences in terms of practice, exactly how you move within the tea room, down to as minute a detail as do you enter with your right foot first or your left foot first, and how do you handle certain utensils, etc. And that's common across all Japanese literary and cultural practices. Historically, you have different schools of poetry. For example, they might, teach certain ways of composing poems. They might have said, we take some certain Chinese characters and we vocalize them this way. Another lineage is vocalizing in a different way. You have all the different schools of karate teaching, etc., ikebana. So this isn't unique to Chanoyu. And I think we can see that the reason these lineages develop is basically you've got people who want to, like we were talking about before, this is my way, this is the right way to do it. And it's, for people who are teaching the practice, they're earning an income off of it. So you need to differentiate yourself from other people and have people come to you to learn to study because yours is the right way or the best way, or, the way that's most closely connected to this historical Shimasta Sendo Rikyu or whatever it is. So the same families claim that through the blood connection. Historically, other schools claimed it by saying, well, we're the direct recipients of his teachings. And that's how our founder was his direct student, not the blood relationship. So you get all of these differences emerging. But at
Mm.
its core, all of the schools are around these practices for preparing and consuming matcha.
And in terms of like how knowledge is transferred, when you become a student and you put yourself on a path in one of these schools, like can you talk a little bit about like the oral tradition of teaching and
Hmm.
sort of this culture of I guess not asking questions or being intellectual curiosity doesn't seem like it's very encouraged in this type of learning.
Yeah. And I think that probably depends on the teacher that you're with as well. But I would say that the idea of not asking questions and learning by observation is very widespread in Chanoyu, and it's also widespread across other Japanese practices, including the traditional arts or cultural practices, we might call them. So again, that's not unique to, and I would say you more broadly find it in Japanese society anyway than Western society. You're told something and okay, so that's the way it is, rather than immediately asking, but why? But why is that the case? Which I
Yeah.
think is the more like typically Western reaction to something. And so in Chanoyu, when you become a student of one of these schools, you enroll to study. And if we look, like just to connect it to what I was saying earlier about my research, there are records of enrollment from the T schools even as far back as several hundred years ago. And so for me, that was one way I could look for in terms of women's participation, like were women listed in these records of students who are being enrolled. But the issue there was I could not get access to those records of enrollment for the SEN schools.
Mm.
They don't release them to scholars like me. But I was able to find women's names in some records of enrollment from other T schools, not Urasenke and Motesenke. And so even today, you register, you're enrolled with the school, and then you progress through a licensing system. And these developed historically as well. It's a way, again, to kind of control access to knowledge and who's getting access to that knowledge, and also a
These
way of
secret
making money.
teachings, right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's a way of making money. You pay as you progress, and the licenses that you receive, it's always said that it's not to say you have mastered this. It's a license to say you can now go on to study the next set of practices, because
Mm.
yes, it's supposed to be a path of continual learning. So at the early levels, or the sort of junior levels, I suppose, you do have published material starting to be available from a few hundred years ago, and today we have like textbooks and things, and it lays out all of the procedures. But you get to a point of the secret teaching where everything is transmitted orally from teacher to student, and nothing's written down, and that continues today to be a practice across all of the schools of tea, as far as I'm aware. And I think we can see it pretty clearly as like a way of controlling knowledge and access to knowledge. It's also from a pedagogical perspective, it does make sense, because there's this sort of controlled way of like progressing as a student practicing. And I think the idea is if you give someone too many options all at once, or you show them too many things at once, it becomes too complicated. And so
Mm.
you are building, you start as a student of tea learning the basics, we call it wari geiko. So you're
Yep.
learning the individual steps, like exactly how to hold the chasen, exactly how to wipe the nuts in it, the Rapperware tea container for thin tea, for matcha that's going to be used to prepare thin tea. Um, and so you're building, and you start with very like easy, basic tea making procedures as you progress, and there's no set time frame. There's some people who just are happy to keep studying kind of at a basic intermediate level, and don't want to either pay the money or invest the energy and the time to go further into the secret teachings. And then there's other people who, they're all in, and they're like, a couple of years into studying, and I want to learn more and more. And it also depends on the teacher. Some teachers will
Mm.
progress people faster than other teachers. All of those commissions, though, come from the central school headquarters. If you're talking about a school like Omotesenke or Urasenke that are very large and have tens of thousands of registered students all over the world, um,
Mm.
it's no one at the headquarters is verifying. They're just relying on the teacher locally saying, like, this student is ready to progress. I'd
Mm.
like to this permission for them to go on to the next level.
In both a very centralized and decentralized system at the
Yeah.
same
Yes,
time.
Yeah.
yeah, that's true. Because it's like everything goes to the headquarters for permission, but like you said, it's kind of decentralized because they're relying on that teacher at the local level. And I've certainly heard stories of teachers who are progressing students through, but not really actually teaching them the procedures that they're receiving licenses for. That, like in any industry, you have people who are maybe a little
Mm.
shady or dodgy, and the teachers make money as well. They charge more for lessons that are at that higher level of secret teaching. And they may receive gifts of money from their students when those licenses are handed out. And that it's called the Iamoto system that we can think of as like a pyramid structure. That developed a few hundred years ago as well. And a scholarship around that is generally about creating this system of control. So I think that's the more cynical view of it, but it's true. But I also think we can think about it pedagogically, like it does. Having seen it in action a couple of decades now and progressed through it myself and seen other students, I think it does make sense to, to some extent, like limit people have this kind of controlled structure around learning, and you're building steps through your practice.
This whole system and the idea of secret teaching, it's also not unique to Japan too, because when you kind of cross-reference with other culture, like you see kind of a similar system being done in like Zen Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism. And I wonder if there's any linkage between Buddhism and Chanoyu, this Yamoto system.
Yeah, and historically, there's a lot of links between Chanoyu and Buddhism. I'm not aware myself of any like direct connection in terms of like the secret teachings, but I wouldn't be surprised. Like I think, like you said, it's not specific to Chanoyu, and I think it's like a wider practice that exists both for pedagogical reasons and reasons of maintaining control.
Right.
So something that you've talked about in your book, and is a big focus of it, is the fact that there's sort of a glass ceiling that women practitioners cannot progress past. Is that a defined ceiling? And where is that ceiling?
I don't think it's defined in the sense that I've never seen anything where any of the schools of tea have said explicitly, like a woman can never progress to this rank. But it is clear, because a woman has never progressed to that rank, that they are not able to do so, if that makes sense. And so we think at the very top you have the Iemoto, the head of the school, head of the household, and we haven't ever had a woman as an Iemoto in any of the schools of tea. And that position is passed down patrilineally. And when there's not been a male heir available to inherit, a man has been adopted from one of the branch families. So historically, if you look at the three Zen schools of tea, they have done that. So you've had Urasenke, Iemotos who have been adopted in from the Omotesenke family, and then they become, a trained and become the Urasenke heir. And that's, again, this isn't specific to Chanoyu either. We see across Japanese culture more broadly, and historically, this practice of like adopting sons in to be household heads, etc., and take over family businesses, or adopting via marriage. So, marrying in as the son-in-law, who then becomes the next head of the household, the family lineage, whatever it is. And even below the Iemoto, you have this next level of teachers that are called Gyote. And at that Gyote level of teachers, there's some interesting translations that happen into English. You also then have below that these ranks that are translated into English as like professor and associate professor and assistant professor of tea. So women can hold those ranks, but we've never seen in the I actually am not 100% sure on the smaller schools of tea. Some of those schools are so small that you have an Iemoto who has like 50 students. So they don't have a bunch of ranks beneath them. But in the large schools like Urasenke and Omotesenke, you have all of these ranks of teachers below. And at the Gyote Sensei rank, so that's the teaching level immediately below the Iemoto, those positions have also never been held by women. Supposedly in Urasenke, I believe there was one woman during the World War II period who attained that rank because of the shortage of men because they were involved at war. But I actually
Hmm.
don't know the details of that, and it's never happened since then. And it's pretty widely known and discussed. Like women who are very experienced and senior, people will sometimes say, like, if she was a man, she would be a Gyote sensei at this point, but
Hmm.
she's a woman, so she won't be. And then often, not always, but a lot of those Gyote sensei positions, it's also like men who are like born into a certain family that has the connections to Omote Senke or a Senke who kind of will rise to that position, if you like. So there's a lot of patriarchal or patrilineal structures at play. And again, I think that's a reflection more broadly of Japanese cultural practices. And if we look at something like it's on the more conservative traditional culture side of,
Hmm.
of Japanese culture, so it's not a place where we should expect to see like radical acts of
Hmm.
feminism or of, gender equality. It's generally something that people just kind of accept and don't question or push back again.
Do you see this situation being changed recently? Has there been any discussions about this kind of change within the Chanoyu community?
Oh, yeah, because we
Uh,
heard there might be a woman motto for Urasenke, and now there's a female prime minister of Japan. Like, it seems like there's some progress.
yeah, although I think a lot of people would say that she's not the new prime minister isn't exactly the great feminist.
Yeah,
But
she's
Yeah.
very
like
conservative.
she's a woman prime minister, but she's very conservative.
She's very
And,
conservative.
and not a champion of women's rights by any means. She's a promoter of the law, for example, that forbids married couples from having different surnames, which essentially means that women have to take the husband's surname. And she said
Mm.
things like that if a
Wow,
mother
that's
has a different
crazy.
surname from her children, she can't bond with them. We're talking about a woman prime minister, but she's very
Wow.
conservative. So I don't know at the top levels, like within the, Urasenke in a sanctum or Motesenke in a sanctum, whether they are having these conversations. And imagines maybe they are, but we are not aware of them. Certainly among like the professional level of people that I'm connected with, we talk about it and say like we would love to see a change, but I think we're all like relatively kind of shrugging our shoulders, like we know it probably won't happen. Some people were talking about a few years ago within Urasenke that, it seemed one of the daughters was progressing a little more and more, seemed more keen and publicly involved in the family business than her brother. And people were like speculating and wondering, like, would something change and happen? But, he's kind of, stepped up, if you like, and he's been designated as the heir apparent. And that put to bed
Mm.
those sorts of speculations. And I think it was also a bit of wishful thinking on a lot of people's parts that something change like that would happen. I think the first thing that would happen would we would be that we would get a woman designated as a Gyope sensei before we would ever get a woman designated as an Iemoto. I also think that we're more likely to see a woman in a leadership position in one of the smaller schools of tea.
Mm. I'll speak for Sam and I as outsiders because we're both not in from the culture, but we're also not tea ceremony practitioners. How should we interpret like this institutionalized sexism and the way we, I don't know, mentally frame or position, traditional tea ceremony? Like, because I feel like it's given sort of every benefit of the doubt, and everyone hails it as
Mm,
this thing in matcha that we must respect. But I don't think most people are aware that, like, these institutions are deeply sexist, implicitly and explicitly. Is it fair that we're making this judgment?
mm. I guess I would say it's not specific to China. Like I would say this is a reflection of Japanese society and the institutionalized
Mm.
sexism that we see across Japanese society. And like I said before, when you look at something like Chanoyu, it is on the traditional conservative side of culture. So it's not the place that we should be looking to see
Revolution, yeah.
revolution. Yeah. And like we were just talking about with the new Japanese prime minister, I think broadly when we look at Japanese culture today in 2025 and over the last 50 years, if we want to go further, it is institutionalized sexism is and deeply embedded patrilineal and patriarchal structures broad across Japanese culture and Japanese institutions. And so I think it would be unfair of us to criticize Chanoyu specifically for this. I also don't think that that means that we should ignore it. And certainly, as someone who is a feminist and a historian of women and a Chanoyu practitioner, I'm very aware of this and I wrestle with it and it frustrates me. And when I have the opportunity in a small way to do something or say something, I do. And a lot of other practitioners I know do the same. And sometimes you unfortunately just have to boil inside with rage and hold your tongue and just think to yourself, like, when you see something happening, just think this isn't, it's not right, but like, what can I do in this moment about it? Yeah.
Dr. Corbett, just a question out of my curiosity and not really related to Chanoyu either. Speaking of like females' role in Japanese society and culture, it's not like unheard of for female leadership in Japanese society because they had like female emperors and a lot
Yeah.
of female deities. In China, we only had one female emperor throughout the few thousand
Japan
years
has
of history.
been
But
more,
in Japan, they had a lot. So how do we interpret that? How did they perceived as a female leader, or is that like femaleness being perceived at all when they are being seen as emperor or deity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't want to be like oversimplified, but the general narrative historian would describe is that over the long course of Japanese history, we see a greater shift towards more patriarchal structures, lineal structures, local as a marriage system, and more what we would define in today's terms as institutionalized sexism and gender discrimination, etc. So the emperors, I don't know the dates off the top of my head, but we're talking about empresses. We're going further back in Japanese history, right? And I don't remember off the top of my head, I'm sorry, the most recent empress, but it's certainly hundreds of years ago. And so, and when we look at the Heian period, so like 700s through to the 900s, we're seeing a lot of what we call matrilocal marriage, so men marrying into a woman's family, things like this. We're seeing women have the ability to hold and inherit land and land ownership, and a lot of that starts to shift. And when we get into the early modern or Edo periods, the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, we're seeing more patriarchal or patrilineal structures. Patrilocal marriage becomes the norm, so the woman marrying into the man's family. And then we actually see even more institutionalized patriarchal and sexist structures, if you like, developing in Japan with the influence of westernization in the late 19th and early 20th century. I think that's something a lot of Westerners like to ignore, but I think it's pretty clear when you look at Japanese history over the long period. But it is interesting, like with the current imperial family, there's been these questions around the succession there, and the current imperial household law that is a modern product forbids an empress. And every time people keep raising, but there's been empresses historically. What's the problem here?
Yeah.
There's been the succession issues in the imperial family as well, of like lots of girls being born and not enough boys being born. What are we going to do? And then there's suddenly a boy is born and okay, crisis averted. We don't need to revise the law. So yeah, it's certainly an intriguing
21st century
question.
Only in Japan.
So this is actually more recent when you are comparing to the long history of
and
Japan.
I'm not trying to say that like Japan in the 700s or 1300s was some kind of like feminist paradise either. Ideas around like feminism and like gender equality in the sense that we understand it today, we shouldn't be looking for. But certainly women, especially at those elite social levels of the imperial court, like you said, there were empresses and women were owning property, inheriting property, holding that kind of power in ways that we don't see.
And getting properly educated too, like the author of The Tales of Genji, she's a female author.
Yeah, we see high levels of literacy for women and education in the Heian period, so when Tale of Genji was written, also in the Edo period. So coming back to my research with women's participation in Chanoyu 18th and 19th century, I was talking about those commercially available books that were being written and included segments on Chanoyu and encouraging women to study. They were able to be published and have an audience because women had very high rates of literacy.
Hmm. Interesting. Wow, fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I know we're running short on time. There's one topic I really wanted to discuss before this ended, and that's when we think of tea culture in Japan and Chanoyu culture, there's very little emphasis on the actual production of the tea. I feel like it's outside of everyone's mental model. And I kind of wanted to understand, like, historically, why it was that case. And, like, our current understanding is that just farmers were so low in terms of social status. And that's why we don't think of them as part of tea culture. But I would love to, I don't know, like, have that validated, or if you could add any color to why it's really not the focus. Seems both historically and even to this day, it seems.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can answer the question like in a way that is really more than speculating because that, to be honest with you, it's not something I've thought that much about until you brought it up. Certainly, when I think about the uh, primary sources that I'm familiar with, if we look at like tea diaries or records of tea gatherings, they're a really important primary source for historians of Chanoyu. When we look at those from the 16th century, 17th, 18th centuries, I don't recall ever seeing that many details about the matcha specifically. The more details are about, it's about who was present at the tea gatherings, the host, the guests, and then the utensils used, the objects.
Mm.
I'm also just thinking though that like sometimes you look at things and you look for what you're looking for. So like I was looking at records of tea gatherings to find names of women. So that like was my focus when I looked at them. Other people are looking at records of tea gatherings to look for specific for the material culture. So maybe they're trying to find records where a specific chai and ceramic tea container was being used or things like that. So it could be that it's there and I just haven't noticed, but I don't think so. Certainly those other texts that I was talking about, like writings about Chanoyu for kind of a general audience of commoners, both men and women. I don't remember the matcha itself being described as like a product. It might be that it's in different publications rather
Mm.
than the ones about Chanoyu. I feel like Chanoyu is always the focus is more like a practice and as on the aesthetics and on the etiquette and comportment side of things and less writings about the matcha itself. As I'm talking, I'm sort of wondering, like, is that because it's taken for a given? Like, sometimes you don't need to describe something if it's so, like, ubiquitous and obvious
Mm.
to the reader. But I would say, like, in terms of my, like, current understanding of tea practice, I think it depends on the individual practitioner and their teacher and the group that they're part of. I think some people emphasize it more than others. Like in the group that I'm studying with in LA, we're all pretty interested in like matcha itself and we try different blends and brands and we will tend to try if it's a new one, we'll try it first in the museum, so like in the kitchen area and just like whisk up
Mm.
bowls for each other and like, okay, what do we think of this one? Is it one that we would try actually using in a tea gathering or not? Because of course your whole focus is at the end of the day like making a delicious bowl of tea for your guests. So it is the quality of the matcha is important. And then what's always been part of tea practice is the discussions between the guest and the host. And just like today, historically, a guest would always ask the host about the matcha. What blend have you used? Where is it from? So that's always been a part of the practice. So I don't know if I'm like fully answering the question.
In your current practice and what you see across, like, the Urasenke global community, like, how
Mhm.
do they form product distinctions, and how do they evaluate, like, high quality from low quality? Like, what are their anchors for drawing these distinctions and forming their own preferences?
So I think first and foremost, the biggest distinction is are you using the tea for koito or cha? So are you making it into thick tea or thin tea? And often we're relying on the brand itself to tell us that. So if you look at like Maruku Koyama as a really big brand, and they have their teas that are designated for Urasenke and Omotesenke, etc. And they have ones that are given the seal of approval by the Iemoto.
Yeah.
And certainly certainly in Urasenke, in any group that I've studied with, because I started in Japan and I studied in Australia and now I've studied in the US, we always, most of the time, are using Maruku Koyamen and different blends from them. And so they're telling us, like, this is designated for Koita, this is designated for Usucha. And then I'd say it's just taste. Do you like it? Do you think that your guests will like it? Some of that's personal preference. I definitely think in the tea group that I'm in LA right now is the group where there's been the most discussion among the members and with our teacher about like trying different blends, like I was saying, and do we like this and what do we think of that? That wasn't sort of common in other groups that I've studied in. It was just like the teacher had it there and it's like, this is the matcha that we're using today, and then we would often use the same matcha most of the time and there's no discussion around that. So maybe that's to do with our teacher. It's probably also to do with the fact that we have a few people in our current group who are like more interested in that kind of thing. And maybe also that it's easier now to get and access like different blends of matcha than it was even like 10, 15 years ago. We can buy stuff here now in the US that we couldn't buy 10 years ago. And then a lot of us in our group travel back and forth to Japan pretty often, both the Japanese and non-Japanese people. So then we might pick something up while we're there that we can bring back and things like that.
Got it. Makes sense.
And I think the only thing I can say is that like when I'm talking about taste, like I don't know if I have like the full language and the words that people in the tea industry would be using to describe things. But like when I'm tasting a new matcha, one of the things I've noticed with some of the ones I've tried here that have been created in the US is I drink it and I'm like, oh, I don't like this because either it doesn't really have a flavor or like it's just kind of bland or nothing. Or I've had ones that almost taste like dusty, like both the taste is dusty and the texture feels a bit dusty. And so that's where I'm just like, I drink it and other people in the group that often drinking it at the same time that we try it, and we're just like, oh no, we're not going to use that. We wouldn't serve that because it just doesn't taste nice to us. Or sometimes if it tastes too bitter, and I might not want to use it. So there's probably a whole like world of terminology that I don't know. That the people in the tea industry would use.
We've heard of some matcha, some very high-end matcha that's like Hanzu shaded, Asahi cultivar, or some Urasenke, very traditional in Japan, like older Japanese ladies who are lifelong Urasenke practitioners trying it and saying that it's not real matcha because it's not bitter.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, you want it to be bitter, but you don't want it to be so bitter that your guests are like screwing up their face when they drink it.
That's when the wagashi comes in.
Yeah.
As a last question, I know you're working on some really interesting new research about how Westerners were exposed to matcha like 100 years ago and sort of the first exposures. Would love to learn more about that research, and I know you're turning it into a book as well.
Yes, well, I'm still deciding if it'll be a book. I'm still kind of working on the materials and figuring out what I've got. But I do have some publications coming out from this research. So I started looking in 2019. I found some references to some elite foreigners from the diplomatic community, like ambassadors in Tokyo in the 1880s and 1890s, studying Chanoyu and holding tea gatherings. I just thought, what? Wow, that's surprising. And so that intrigued me first. And I found the references in Japanese newspaper articles that were published about it. And I was interested in that. And then I had been doing other research and was supposed to go to Japan in 2020 and obviously couldn't because of the pandemic. And I suppose pandemic boredom kind of kicked in, and I started reading a bunch of travel diaries from Westerners who were traveling to Japan in the Meiji period from the 1870s, 1880s. And a lot of them, they're out of copyright, so they've been digitized and they're available online. So I was just able to read them that way. And I started noticing that like quite a few of them had references to attending a Chanoyu tea gathering and or drinking matcha. And so I became kind of interested in that. And then I think over the course of the last 5 years with this matcha boom increasing, kind of like broader interest in this research when I've talked to people about it has also grown, and people are like, oh, that is actually interesting to hear about what Westerners first thought of matcha when they were encountering it. So I do have, actually, it's probably something that some of your listeners would be interested in. I don't know if you're aware of it, at UC Davis, the University of California,
Oh, yeah.
Davis. Yeah, there's a Global Tea Institute there, the GTI for short. And they bring together like academic research as well as industry research. And it's really great. And Catherine Bennett, who's the founder and director of the GTI, is fantastic scholar and fantastic person. And so they have launched a book series with Brill as the press. And so the first book, and the book series is Global Tea Studies. And the first book is coming out next year. And it is a kind of broad ranging look at tea globally. And there's both scholars and industry people who've written for it. There's 2 chapters that are on Chanoyu and matcha and Japan focused. One is by Akko Yoshino, who's from the Japan Tea Association, and she's writing about Chanoyu at the World's Fairs in North America. So looking at these like World's Fairs expos that were held in the Meiji period, so late 19th and early 20th century, and how Chanoyu was presented to American audiences. And then in my chapter, I'm addressing this question of what did Westerners think of both Chanoyu as a practice and matcha as a beverage when they first encountered it in the Meiji period, so late 19th, early 20th century. And I'm using these travel diaries and newspaper articles as my sources. So there's also like a Western American, Australian, British newspaper articles I've been finding that were talking about like around the world, and including matcha, or just specifically talking about matcha in Japan. And so I think what was happening was like this was a new enough beverage for people that were encountering Japanese culture for the first time, either the wealthiest tourists, like people who could actually travel to Japan. And you had to be pretty wealthy in the 1880s, 1890s, early 90s to travel to Japan. And then people who were encountering it at World's Fairs and expositions outside Japan. And then also just in like the newspaper articles, you know, from like the Wichita Eagle newspaper in Wichita, Kansas in 1888. Those readers probably weren't going to get to try matcha, but it was something that was interesting for the newspaper to kind of write about. And Robert Hellier has a great book called Green with Milk and Sugar: When Japan Filled America's Teacups. And that book looks at how loose leaf tea, particularly sencha, was very popular in the US in the 1800s. I had no idea before I read that book, but they were putting milk and sugar in it. That's where the title comes from. And so what I found was a lot of these Western writers were actually contrasting matcha with the, at the time, more popular and widely known loose leaf Japanese green tea. And so they're sometimes saying things like, we much preferred the ordinary infusion, by which they mean sencha. I think that's because they were adding milk and sugar to it, whereas the matcha they were being served at World's Fairs outside Japan, or the tourists who could go to Japan, was matcha as we do it in Chanoyu, which is neat. It's just matcha and water. And so they're pretty critical. They're saying things like it's green gruel, it's more bitter than quinine, it's unpalatable. A lot of stuff like that.
Wow.
Yeah, unpalatable. My mother would agree with them, quite frankly. She did. And then, but on the opposite side, I've also found a lot of sources that show that there were Westerners who were studying Chanoyu pretty seriously in this time period, and they're not talking about the matcha. But I have to assume that, like me, they liked it, because otherwise why would they keep studying for however many years and hosting tea gatherings, because you can't do that without drinking matcha. So I think it's the people who didn't like it who were the ones who are like actually writing more about it because they didn't like the taste of it. So yeah, that'll be out early next year. And then I have a few more publications in the works from that research that are like other academic chapters in edited books and so on. And then I'm working with my friend and fellow Urasenke practitioner and fellow scholar Michelle Carragher, who's a professor at UCLA. We led that teaching tea project together that I talked about, the online resources. We're working on co-editing a book that'll have contributions from other scholars, and that will be on Chanoyu and matcha globally beyond Japan. So that will have both historical and contemporary.
Uh, Very cool. I would love to learn the story of how Urasenke just came to dominate, like, all the tea practices globally. It is
Yeah,
incredibly impressive what they've built. You can
right.
go to Venezuela, can be in Paris,
Hmm.
you can be anywhere, and it feels like there's a
Yeah,
Urasenke
there really
program.
is. Yeah, I've met with Urasenke people in Sofia, Bulgaria, in Mexico City, and yeah, all over the world. It
So,
really is like a global reach. And yeah,
Very
I
cool.
think like we alluded to earlier, that's the last 75 to 60 years that that's happened. But because that's happened, Urasenke has become so dominant that it's kind of affected people's understanding of the history.
yeah, that makes sense because that's how they were exposed to it for the first time in, whatever circumstance or country they found themselves in at some public demonstration or something. That's a really interesting story. Well, I can't wait for that research, and we'll, link
Thanks.
everything in the show notes for people because 'cause I'm sure there's a lot of listeners that might be interested.
Sure, and
Yeah.
I'll definitely let you know when that book from the Global Tea Studies series is out, because I think it is something that probably some of your listeners would be interested in. So I'll let you know early next year when that's out.
Oh, that'd be awesome, and we'll help spread the word on that.
Mm.
Yeah,
Looking forward to reading that.
Yeah, me too. We need more English language tea literature and research.
Yeah.
It's so nice.
Yes, we do.
yeah,
Yes, we do.
yeah. Well, that's why they have the Global Tea Studies series. So hopefully we'll get some good books coming out from it in the next few years.
We hope so.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you
Mm.
so much for your time. We really appreciate you coming on. Really recommend everyone who's listening to pick up a copy of your book, Cultivating Femininity: Women in Tea Culture in Edo and Meiji Japan.
Thank
Really was
you.
kind of a bombshell book, at least for me, in like breaking down narratives that I had been told and kept hearing over and over, which has kind of led me to become a little more skeptical when acquiring new information.
That's great. That's what I would hope for. And I'll just plug that the ebook is actually available for free. The publisher at the University of Hawaii Press made it open access at the time of publication. So you can buy a print version in paperback and I think still in hardback, but we wanted to make the ebook open access so that it's more readily available for people. So it's not a mistake if you see it for $0 on any of your preferred platforms, including the Giant A, or you can get it directly for free download from the University of Hawaii Press website.
That's awesome. So thank you, dear listeners, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.
See you in the future.